Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Titania, and first things first, let's go over the abilities. So, Titania's first ability is Spellbind, which is mostly used for the hold to cast, which makes you immune to all status effects. This is nice as it allows you to drop Prime Sure-Footed from all of your builds, and also gives you status immunity to things like magnetic procs, which drain your energy and are annoying, and heat procs, which kill you. The second ability is Tribute, which gives you 50% damage reduction from thorns, 50% evasion from dust, and companion damage from full moon, which is mostly useless. I'll talk about that later. And entangle, which is a 25% snare on enemies, which is also mostly useless as 25% snare really doesn't do all too much, especially for how annoying this buff is to upkeep. The third ability is Lantern, and the first one that we're going to spend some time on. So this ability is a CC, very similar to Octavia's second ability, and it has a nifty little augment, which gives you a weapon damage buff. Since it is a raw weapon damage buff, this means that it affects things like Breach Surge, which is very interesting. However, there were some multiple problems with it. The first one is that, well, it requires an augment mod, so that's already a strike. Second strike is, for Lantern to work, and especially Beguiling Lantern, you really need adequate range, and the rest of her kit really doesn't care if she has that much range. So that's strike 2. Strike 3 is if you compare Beguiling Lantern to other weapon damage buffs, such as, let's use Eclipse for example. If you have the same strength, Eclipse will actually make you do more raw damage. You might notice that I said raw damage because it gets worse. Beguiling Lantern, for some reason, doesn't take into account the additional damage you're dealing when inflicting status effects. What I mean by this isn't that it's not double dipping, but say you hit an enemy without Beguiling Lantern for a 100, you will apply a 900 slash tick. If you then apply Beguiling Lantern and hit them for a 200, your slash tick still only deals 900. With Eclipse, which is another weapon damage buff, your slash tick would also get doubled. So that is its final strike, and that's why I didn't really like this build, but it is a build playstyle that she can utilize, which is why I wanted to talk about it. As for the other two builds, they are both pixie builds. This first one is a Nourish build for sustain and viral and some CC. Since we're using Nourish, it allows us to use Archon Vitality for doubling our heat procs on our Dex Pixia. This allows us to mod for raw heat with Prime Heated Charge and slot some quality of life mods like Anemic Agility on the pistols for even more DPS. Since it is a raw tank build, Aviator is nice, Aerodynamic is great, and of course Boreal's Hatred for some sustain and for DDR. Razorwing Blitz allows you to drop Arcane Velocity for Arcane Blessing at the cost of having to use Razorwing Blitz, which essentially makes your movement completely unplayable. If you do not like Razorwing Blitz, just keep Arcane Velocity and instead just drop it for whatever you want. I preferred Boreal's Anguish just for a further 20% DR. As for the final build, it was a Pillage build, and this is the health and shield tank variant of it. So again, we have Aviator, but we need corrosive projection to full strip, and speaking of full stripping, when fully buffed out with Molt Augmented, we are only 14% strength away from full stripping in one cast. There are two ways to achieve the final 14%. A, you run Madurai, and every 20 seconds you go into your operator and double dash at the ground. B, you run a single Tau Forged Red Strength Shard, and now you full strip in one cast, or two non-Tau Forged Red Shards, and now you armor strip in one cast. Another option you can, also this build could be min-max slightly further, but I do not have the polarities for it, so I will show a picture of what it would look like right here. And thirdly, this build can be interchanged into a raw shield gate build very easily. You drop Vitality as you no longer need health, Aviator because you don't need the DR, Boreal's Hatred, again because you don't need the DR, and Adaptation for the same reason. You replace adaptation with rolling guard because you can roll in Razor Wing, you just have to side roll. Replace your Exilus with Power Drift. Now you do not need to upkeep Madurai, and you do not need any Archon shards. You replace the Boreals mod with just flat Streamline for even more sustain. And the final mod, you want it to be an Augur mod of your choice. The reason you want it to be an Augur mod is because if you have 2 Augur mods on your pistol and 1 Augur mod on your main build, you will reset your shield gate with pillage on cast and on retract instead of only on retract. The Augur mod is flex, so you can either do Augur Secrets for more strength for your 4, or Augur Reach for some quality of life for the initial range of pillage and for tribute. You could also do Augur Message for a bit of sustain, but having too much duration on pillage can be a bad thing. So I preferred Reach for some quality of life. Rest of the kit is very simple. Primary for either killing acolytes or AoE if you're using a weapon Titania build, especially if you're using Augur mods on your pistol. Secondary, again, whatever you want. If you want Augur mods on it, just use like an epitaph or something so then it can also prime. Or if you want it for dealing with acolytes, I was using the Spore Laser. This isn't modded correctly as it just doesn't have enough forma. Ideally it would be primed heated charge and 90/90 mods, but it's just not format enough. Furax Wraith for the 45% fire rate on our secondaries, including Dex Pixias. Madurai for the 40% strength, and even if you don't need it anymore, for the Phoenix Talons passive. Dex Pixia builds, I already showed the heat one, here's the viral one, Seeker for punch through for pseudo AoE, and the Dewata I just have all the mods on that affect your razor flies. However, this is modded incorrectly as I monkey brained and looked on the wiki to see what buffed razor flies. It's all IPS and just formatted it for a dash, but I just completely forgot Gladiator Might existed, and ideally this would be a V polarity and Gladiator Might would be there. Companion doesn't really matter too much, you just want the synth mods equipped, that way you can always pick up health orbs while in Razor Wing. Now let's move on to the rest of the video. Now moving on to the rankings, we'll be discussing Titania in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path MOT run with no specters and no on-call. Firstly, her KPM. So, Titania actually has pretty decent KPM, especially for a frame who you wouldn't think would have that great KPM, where you're forced to use single target pistols with no AoE attached to them outside of any punch through that you mod onto them, and nothing else really in her kit to amplify her kills, such as a suck or an AoE ability. However, she does have one small thing in her kit that does help a very tiny bit, which is of course the razor flies. But even with the razor flies, it comes with a stipulation. If you choose to get additional KPM with Titania, not only do you have to mod the Dewata, which forces you to format multiple times, but you also have to change how you actually play her. See, the razor flies only have like 200 or so health, and they do not respawn unless you go in and out of your Razor Wing. Not only does this drain your energy, as you have to constantly use the initial cast, which costs like 25, which obviously isn't much, but when you have to go in and out of your Razor Wing multiple times a minute, the energy does add up, and it does affect your sustain. Not only that, it also affects your survivability in both a positive and a negative way. When the razor flies are alive, you are significantly tankier than if you just let them die and ignored them. However, going in and out of Razor Wing is dangerous, as you're fairly vulnerable, and when you have to do it constantly, you can get killed doing so. The other issue is you don't really get that much higher KPM when you do it, and you also have to cast the tribute buff to make it worthwhile. which is also just annoying because that's more energy that you have to spend. Obviously, again, it's only like 37 every 2 minutes, but that does add up, especially when you add it on top of going in and out of Razorwing. And not only that, but speaking of the survivability, where whenever you leave Razorwing, you're more vulnerable. Any time that you go and cast Tribute, that's also you being vulnerable because the ability is so clunky. You have to look at an enemy, you have to be within X range, cast it, and then fly into the buff, and then switch to the new one and repeat. If you ignore your Razorflies, you only have to do it twice, but if you're trying to utilize the Razorflies, you have to do it 3 times. So that leaves you vulnerable for a longer period of time, which again can lead to getting you killed. And all of this for like a mediocre, like 3 to 5 more KPM. So it's up to you if you want to do it, but it is something worth mentioning because it is technically optimal. It just is kind of annoying and really isn't worth it unless you're just trying to get the absolute most out of Titania. That being said, in my multiple runs with Titania, I was getting roughly 95 to 100 KPM without Razorflies, and getting roughly 95 to 105 KPM with the Razorflies. That being said, her KPM also has the problem with not really scaling that well because her pistols eventually won't really be able to kill the super tanky enemies that quickly. And eventually you're going to get to a point to where you're going to start jumping out of your Razorwing to not only reset your Razorflies, but to also prime the enemies. And at that point, the KPM is going to jump down significantly. So for these reasons, I'm going to give her KPM rank a B+, for not scaling well, and not only does it not scale well, but when it starts to falter, you also lose a lot of energy and your survivability goes down significantly. Speaking of survivability, let's move on to that. So for Titania survivability, she has a decent bit going for her. So her second ability, of course, gives her 50% DR and 50% evasion. Her fourth ability also gives her pseudo evasion, as she's just so tiny that the enemies struggle to hit her. And then she also has the benefit of being able to freely run all of the air damage reduction mods, as you're pretty much always going to be in the air. There are some downsides, however, such as her not really being able to slot Arcane Blessing easily on her build unless you slot Razorwing Blitz, which is its own entire detriment to her build, and her low base armor. On top of that, a lot of her abilities leave her vulnerable, which I've already briefly mentioned, such as any time that you have to leave your Razorwing for whatever, you are a sitting duck, and any time that you're trying to keep your tribute buffs up, you are a sitting duck. This gets amplified further if you ever let your tribute buffs run out, because they do a whole lot. If you ever have your evasion and your damage reduction down, you are playing with fire, and you can just randomly get one-shot. Of course, we are playing Warframe, so even with the buffs up, you can still randomly get one-shot because of a Blitz Eximus that just happens to hit you even though you're flying through the air, or a Bombard that just one-shots you because Bombards do that. Health tanks all pretty much have the same problem, where even if they are mostly survivable, you will still occasionally randomly just get one-shot for absolutely no reason. Furthermore, if you try to go a shield gate build, your only real way of shield gating is with pillage. And I've expressed multiple times in the past, if the only way you can shield gate is with pillage, you will also occasionally randomly die. Why? Well, the reason is pillage is a double cast ability. This means you cast it, you get your shield gate, and then it has a duration, and when it times out, you get your shield gate again. You can double cast it for it to retract quickly, but there is a delay before it will give you your shields back. This means what can happen is you just cast pillage, you get your shields back, and an enemy instantly breaks your shield, so then you go to retract the pillage, you don't do it in time, there's a delay, and then you die. this doesn't happen all too much, especially on Titania because of her invasion, but it does happen. Because of these reasons, I will give her survivability a flat B. It's not bad, it could be a bit better though. Now moving on to her viability, and this is where I think a lot of people will disagree with me. So first things first, I will address her Thermal Sunder Relic Nuke build. I personally do not think that this build is nearly as good as everybody thinks it is, and I will do my best to explain why. The first problem that it has is it doesn't actually make the missions quicker. Now you may be thinking I'm completely stupid, but just listen for a few seconds. What does a Titania specifically help with the mission with her killing everything over any other frame in the game, just running Thermal Sender and one-shotting everything? Now your initial reaction will be because she can fly to extraction quicker. Okay, what does the Titania flying to extraction quicker than everybody else do to make the mission go by quicker? And the answer to that is nothing. You will always be time gated by how long it takes your teammates to also run to extraction. So if you're not in a full group with 3 other Titanias, you getting to extraction quicker as Titania does absolutely nothing, unless you're playing with a bunch of like MR5s or something, and you have to wait out the entire minute for force extraction. Other frames, such as Nova with her 3, using Thermal Sunder, or Volt with his 2, or Wisp with her 1, all will actually make the mission go by quicker than a Titania because they also help the team get to the extraction quicker. So I'm not saying that the Thermal Sunder Titania build is bad, I'm just saying that it's not nearly as good as people make it out to be. And outside of that, there really isn't any reason, as far as I know, to really play Titania, as she's not really great at anything other than just because you like her and you find her fun. So for these reasons, I'm going to give her viability a C. Now moving on to her fun, and I think that her fun rank is actually pretty decent because she's a very unique Warframe in the sense that you get to use Arcwing movement inside of every mission, and I personally enjoy the Arcwing movement. On top of that, it's just kind of fun flying around and using normal single target weapons for a change and still getting decent KPM. Where she suffers in her fun is any time that you have to cast her 2, as that is one of the most unfun things in this entire game. And her 3, I can't explain how frustrating it was trying to make a Beguiling Lantern build, as it's just extremely subpar. You are sitting there playing with the range, and you have too much, so then your KPM just drops to like literally 50 or 60, because everything's just CC'd and taking forever to get to you. Or you have too little, and you realize that it's doing absolutely nothing. Trying to make a Beguiling Lantern build was probably the second most frustrating thing I've ever done in any of these videos so far, other than trying to make Gyre work. But I do think the rest of her kit, outside of Tribute, is fun, so I will give her a B rank. In conclusion, Titania is a C+ tier Warframe who is teetering on B tier. I do not believe that she's B tier, as she does have some problems, such as her energy sustain is very mediocre while solo, and in a group it gets even worse. Other problems that she has is her 2 is just very clunky, and it gets tiresome very quickly upkeeping it, even though it lasts 2 minutes, so you wouldn't think it would be that bad, but it is just extremely annoying. If her 2 was to be made a bit less clunky, or if her 3 was buffed to be a bit better, as her 3 is theoretically good, but in reality it isn't, I could see her being a B tier Warframe. That being said, she does have a lot of build variety, which does make her fun in the end, even though she's not that spectacular.